My name is Caroline Webb. I'm 46 years old, a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and for most of my career I've carried a secret that shaped everything. My record, my rank, and my relationship with the one person whose opinion of me mattered most. For 15 years, I gave my silence to protect my father, and he spent 7 of those years calling me a traitor. Have you ever done something significant for someone you love and had them never know? If that has ever been you, tell me in the comments. You are not alone in that. Before I get into what happened, I want to know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to hold something difficult in silence because you believed it was right, hit that like button and subscribe. My father, Captain Richard Webb, United States Navy, retired, was the kind of man who ironed his own shirts. This sounds like a small thing. I have come to understand that it is not. He ironed them with a precision I have never seen matched. Perfect creases, every time, the collar aligned to a standard that could have passed formal inspection. He applied that same standard to everything in his life. His car, his finances, his record, his opinions, his daughter. He was not a cruel man. He was not even, in most ways, a hard man. But he had a definition of things. A definition of right and wrong, of honor and failure, of what a person's word was worth and what it meant to serve. And that definition was not flexible. It had been formed over 4 decades of naval service and had not needed revision in a very long time. I need you to hold that before we go any further. It is the thing that made everything that came after both possible and, eventually, devastating. I was born in 1980 in a Navy hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia, while my father was a lieutenant serving in the surface warfare community. He was 28 years old and had been in the Navy for 6 years and already had the focused, unhurried quality of a man who had found what he was meant to be doing. My mother, Margaret Webb, was a woman of particular warmth and considerable patience. Patience that I suspect she needed in quantities most people would find unreasonable, given who she had married. She was a school teacher before I was born and returned to it part-time when I was old enough for school, and she was the kind of teacher that students remembered for the rest of their lives. She and my father were almost perfectly opposite in their natures. He moved through life by certainty. She moved through it by curiosity. And somehow this worked. It worked for 30 years until it couldn't anymore. My earliest memories of our household are of motion, deployments and homecomings, base housing and rented apartments, the particular smell of a residence that has been lived in briefly and is already beginning to be packed up again. We moved 7 times before I finished middle school. I learned, the way military children learn early, to read a new environment quickly. Who to trust, where the edges were, how to make something feel like home out of boxes, and whatever light came through the windows. My father was away for long portions of my childhood. When he was home, the house organized itself around him without anyone making a conscious decision about it. Not oppressively, just naturally, the way a room tilts slightly toward a window. The memory I return to most often from those early years is a morning in Norfolk when I was 6 years old. My father was preparing to deploy. I had woken before anyone else, some instinct about departure, already calibrated even at that age. And I padded downstairs in my socks to find him in the kitchen, in his dress whites, methodically buttoning his jacket. The kitchen was still mostly dark. The only light came from above the stove. I climbed onto the counter without asking permission, which would normally have earned me a quiet correction. That morning he let it go. I reached out and touched his shoulder boards. The gold bars of a lieutenant, precise and bright in the low light. I asked him what they meant. He turned slightly toward me without breaking his buttoning rhythm and explained rank in terms a 6-year-old could hold. That the bars told people who you were, what you had earned, what was expected of you. He said they were a promise. To the Navy, to the people who served alongside you, to yourself. I asked if I would ever have bars. He finished the last button, smoothed the front of his jacket, and looked at me for a moment. Genuinely considered the question, which I would only understand much later as its own form of respect. He said, "If you work hard enough, you'll have more than I do." I thought about that for years before I understood it wasn't only encouragement, it was a forecast. He could already see something in me that I couldn't see yet. My mother was the other axis of our household. She was the person who remembered where conversations had stopped, who tracked the invisible threads of a family's emotional life, who knew when someone needed to talk and when they needed to be left alone with their thoughts. She kept the warmth in a house that would otherwise have run on precision and task completion. I watched her operate with a quietness that I now recognize as a skill, the skill of making a family cohere. And I understood, even as a child, that the household I grew up in was warmer than it would have been without her. My father understood this too. He did not say it often. He showed it in the way he came home. My mother died in the summer of 1994. Cancer, diagnosed in November of 1993, and gone in 8 months. Thorough and efficient, the way that disease can be when it decides it has somewhere to be. I was 14, my father was 42. The day she died, he drove to the hospital alone and came home alone and sat in the kitchen for a very long time. I came downstairs at some point in the early morning and found him there. He had made coffee that had gone cold. He looked at me across the table, and he said nothing for a while, and I said nothing either, and then he said that we were going to be all right. I believed him. I am not sure he believed himself at that moment, but I believed him. After the funeral, when the last of the extended family had driven back to wherever they had come from, and the casserole dishes had been returned and the house had settled into a quiet it had not held before, we sat at the kitchen table together and ate toast. That was all. We ate toast and we did not say much, and that became the template for how we carried our grief. We were not good at it, or rather, we were both good at the same kind of grief, which is the kind that keeps moving. We made meals. We talked about school and the news and the career that was his whole life, and we did not mention her by name for a long time. I think my father believed, at some deep level, that if he stopped moving, the grief would catch him. He had 40 years of practice at not stopping. I was young enough to copy that strategy without examining it. We both paid for it eventually, in one way or another. What that period gave us, though, was a closeness that I am not sure we would have found otherwise. With my mother gone, we were down to 2, and the 2 of us had to figure out how to occupy the space she had filled. We didn't do it the same way she had. We did it with seriousness and with work, and with the slow, not always comfortable process of my father learning to treat a 14-year-old girl as someone worth a real conversation. I cooked most of our meals. I managed most of the household logistics that he didn't have time for. I became very good at identifying what needed to be done without being told, and at completing things without requiring acknowledgement. These are, I understood much later, exactly the qualities that a naval officer needs. My father had not planned to teach them to me this way. Circumstances arranged the curriculum without consulting either of us. When I was 15, he started asking for my opinion on things, not always following it, but asking. When I was 16, he explained without ceremony why he thought I was capable of something significant if I chose it. He didn't soften the assessment or frame it as encouragement. He delivered it the way he would have spoken to a junior officer whose potential he intended to develop. I knew because of how he operated that he did not say things like that unless he meant them, which meant it landed with a weight that reassurance never could have. I want to describe what our household was like during the years between my mother's death and my commissioning, because it shaped something in me that is relevant to everything that follows. We were a household of 2 people who were, in many ways, too similar to be comfortable together and too committed to each other to be apart. We had my mother's absence in common, the same gap, each of us carrying it differently. We had the Navy in common even before I was formally in it, because the Navy had structured my entire childhood and had become the water we both swam in. We had a shared belief, unspoken, never discussed, simply assumed, that the way to handle difficulty was to keep working. These things held us together, and they also, in a particular way, kept us from having the conversations that might have made the years of estrangement impossible. If we had been better at saying the difficult thing, my father might have asked the question that needed asking in 2011. If I had been better at it, I might have answered. But we were not better at it. We were what we were, and we were that together, and it took 15 years and 5 words to bring us to the place where we could begin to be something more. I applied to the Naval Academy at 17. My father's name went on the application, but he told me explicitly not to use it as a crutch. That the Academy didn't want legacy stories, it wanted to know who I was apart from him. He sat across from me at the kitchen table the night before I submitted it, went through every essay with the same precision he applied to everything, and told me which paragraphs were self-indulgent and which ones were worth keeping. The ones he deemed worth keeping were the ones that had nothing to do with him. the ones that were purely, specifically mine. I resented the editorial intervention at the time. I am grateful for it now. I want to say something about the 4 years that followed, because they matter to this story in a way that is easy to miss. The Naval Academy, in my experience of it, does not primarily teach you seamanship or tactics or the technical requirements of military service. It teaches you something harder to articulate. A relationship to standards that goes deeper than compliance. The question at Annapolis was not whether you would follow the rules. The question was whether you would hold yourself to them even when no one was watching, even when the cost was real. I had been raised by a man who had already answered that question, and I arrived with the answer preformed. But the Academy confirmed it in ways that were not comfortable and not theoretical. I graduated knowing with a precision I hadn't had before where my own lines were and what I would do when someone pushed at them. That knowledge was present in me on the day I walked into the JAG office in Bahrain. I want to be clear about that. I was accepted to Annapolis in the spring of 1998. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. My father read it twice, the way he read everything, and set it on the kitchen table and looked at me across it. He said, "All right, now the work starts." That was the closest thing to a celebration he offered. It was completely enough. I graduated in May of 2002 and was commissioned as an ensign 01, United States Navy. My father, by that point a captain, 06, attended the commissioning ceremony in his dress whites. When the time came to pin my ensign bars, he stepped forward from the designated family area. His fingers were steady and precise. He pinned both bars. He stepped back and looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not name then and still cannot quite place now. Something between satisfaction and something quieter that I have no word for. Then he brought his right hand up in a formal salute. I returned it. My first salute as a commissioned officer of the United States Navy. To my father, he said, "Ensign Webb, well done." 2 words, my rank and a verdict. In the language that we had built between us over 22 years, those 2 words were everything. I have stood in rooms with significant people since then. I have been recognized in ways I did not expect and received commendations that made my colleagues whistle. None of it has landed quite the way those 2 words did in the May sunlight on that commissioning field. That is the honest truth of my father and me, and that is where this story begins. The years that followed were years of work. Naval intelligence suited me. I had my father's patience for the assembly of information and something that I attribute, perhaps unfairly, to the dead, to my mother's instinct for what a person was trying not to say. I had a gift for reading incomplete pictures, for identifying what was absent from a dataset, for sitting with uncertainty long enough that a pattern eventually became visible. The work was often classified. The work was often slow. I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, and I kept that knowledge to myself because I had been raised to understand that the performance of confidence and the possession of it are not the same thing. I developed, during those years, a reputation among my colleagues for a kind of analytical steadiness that came more from temperament than from training, the ability to hold a problem at arm's length, to resist the temptation of a conclusion before the evidence warranted it, to be wrong out loud, when being wrong out loud was the most useful thing. I was not universally liked. I was, I think, generally respected. I will take respect over being liked in a professional context without much deliberation. I made lieutenant junior grade in 2004, lieutenant in 2006. By 2009, I had been promoted to lieutenant commander, 04, at the age of 29, and had a record that my commanding officers described in ways I find uncomfortable to repeat. My father, during this same period, was in the latter portion of a career that had also gone well, if not as far as he had once hoped. The promotion to flag rank, the single star that marks the transition from field officer to something beyond, had passed him by twice. He did not speak of this directly. He spoke of it in the way that men of his generation speak of disappointments. Obliquely, briefly, and with the clear expectation that the subject would not be revisited. By 2009, he was commanding a classified naval intelligence unit in the Arabian Sea Theater, one of the most demanding billets available at his level, and the pressure of that command was doing something to him that I noticed across our phone calls and that I did not fully know how to name. He used the word flexibility a great deal when describing his work. The first time I filed it away, the second time I paid attention. The third time, I was sitting across from him at a restaurant during a port call, and I set down my fork. I had been offered a temporary duty assignment to his command by a mutual colleague who thought the work would suit my specialization. After the third time, he said flexibility. I accepted it. I arrived at his unit in the spring of 2010. His command was professionally tight, and his staff were capable and loyal. But the operating environment had produced habits that I recognized on first observation as the kind that end otherwise good careers. Verbal orders given in lieu of documented ones. Decisions made in the gray space between the authorized and the not. Justified by the speed of the operational environment. A culture of accomplishment that had, over time, allowed the documentation of that accomplishment to become secondary to the accomplishment itself. I watched it for several weeks without saying anything. Then I spoke to him privately, not in front of his staff. I said, "The documentation isn't keeping up with the decisions, Dad." He said, "This isn't Annapolis, Caroline. Out here, by the time the paperwork's been approved, the window's gone." I said, "I know, but the window being gone is survivable. The paperwork not being there is not." He looked at me across the desk with the expression I knew from the kitchen table, from the academy application, from a dozen conversations over the years. Assessing, measuring, arriving at a conclusion he was not going to share immediately. Then he went back to work. He did not change the habit. I made a note and kept watching. The months I spent at his command were among the more instructive of my career, for reasons that had little to do with the operational work itself. I was watching what happens to a gifted officer who has spent 4 decades at the edge of what his institution will absorb and is beginning to run out of runway. The intelligence environment of that period had created conditions in which my father's particular way of operating was simultaneously effective and dangerous. He got results. He was also increasingly willing to get them in ways that the documentation would not support under close examination. I watched him work, and I thought about the conversation about flexibility, and I thought about the distance between flexibility and exposure, and I was not certain that he still saw the line as clearly as he once had. In March of 2011, on the 14th, at approximately 2200 hours local time, a compromised intelligence asset in the Arabian Sea Theater came into position for potential extraction. The standing order from Washington was unambiguous. Stand down. The asset's network was assessed as too exposed, the extraction too risky, the probability of burning additional contacts too high. The order had been in place for several weeks and had not been rescinded. My father received a field communication indicating that the extraction window was narrow, closing, and unlikely to reopen. He was in the operations room. I was also in the operations room. He picked up the handset. He transmitted an unsanctioned extraction order to the field team. I watched him do it. I watched him make the call, and I watched his face after he set down the handset, composed, certain, the face of a man who had just made a decision he was prepared to defend. I did not speak. I noted it. The extraction failed. The asset's cover was compromised within 3 hours. The network burned overnight. 18 intelligence contacts went dark in a 48-hour period. By the following morning, the failure had been flagged through multiple channels, and within 48 hours, a formal naval investigation had been opened. My father understood, when the investigation was announced, exactly what he was looking at. He didn't say so, but I could see it in the particular quality of his stillness. The way an intelligence officer goes very quiet when the dimensions of a problem have become fully clear. I went to the JAG office in Bahrain 36 hours after the investigation opened. I had spent the intervening time composing my statement carefully and thinking through every element of it. Not agonizing, but thinking, which is different. The decision had not taken long to make. The preparation had taken longer. The decision was made in the same quiet way that I made most decisions that mattered. Not in a moment of drama, but in a clear-eyed interval of calculation that produced a result I was prepared to stand behind. I sat across from 2 JAG officers at a plain table under fluorescent light, and I gave my statement. I told them that I had transmitted the unauthorized extraction order, that I had acted on my own interpretation of field intelligence, without authorization, and without the direction or knowledge of Captain Webb, who I stated had not been present in the operations room at the time I made the decision. I was detailed. I was specific. I did not hesitate. I had my hands flat on the table and my voice level and my account fully constructed, because I had been raised by a man who gave information in a way that did not invite second-guessing, and I had inherited that capacity. Every word of it was a lie. He had been in the room. The order had been his. I had transmitted it because he directed me to. I had not made any independent decision. The JAG officers noted my statement. A formal written reprimand was entered on my service record. The investigation into Captain Richard Webb was discontinued for insufficient evidence. He was cleared. He was notified that the inquiry had been resolved and that no action would be taken. He did not ask for details. He was a man who had spent 40 years trusting that the system worked, and the system had appeared to work in his favor, and he accepted that outcome in the same way he accepted all outcomes that aligned with what he understood to be just. That night, alone in my bunk aboard the command ship, I sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and ran the calculation. The reprimand. The next promotion cycle delayed by approximately 2 years. The mark on an otherwise clean record. I ran it through completely. Then I stopped running it. I lay down. I closed my eyes. There was the sound of the ship around me and the low, constant mechanics of it. And I listened to that for a while, and then I went to sleep. I did not tell him what I had done. Not that night, and not in the months after. He was told the investigation had resolved, and he accepted that. And the matter closed in his mind, the way matters close when they resolve in your favor. I told myself he would figure it out eventually, that there would be a moment, a phone call, a quiet dinner, where the pieces arranged themselves correctly and he would come to me and ask. I held that expectation for years without examining it carefully. By the time I examined it, years had passed. Richard Webb retired from the United States Navy in the summer of 2013. He was 61 years old, a captain with 39 years of service behind him. His retirement ceremony was well attended. Colleagues, family, officers who had served under him and wanted to mark the occasion properly. I was there in my dress blues, a commander by then, 05, the delayed promotion finally through, and I stood near the back and watched him receive his flag. He gave a short speech about duty and service and the institution that had given him his life's work. It was a good speech, specific and unsentimental and genuinely grateful. I listened to it and I thought about March of 2011, and I clapped when he received his flag, and I did not say a word. His career, the one he was celebrating, was the career I had helped preserve. I did not say that. My career continued on the schedule the reprimand had imposed. I watched promotion boards come and go with the particular attention of someone who has already calculated what the delay means in practical terms. Commander in 2014, Captain in 2018, Rear Admiral, lower half, in 2022, Rear Admiral, upper half, RADM 08 in 2025. None of this was given to me. Every step was earned on the merits of the work, and the work was good, and I want to be clear about that. The delay that the reprimand imposed did not prevent me from reaching the ranks I reached. It altered the timeline. I had accounted for the alteration when I made the decision, and the accounting held. The years between 2013 and 2019 were years I lived in 2 registers simultaneously. In one register, I was building a career, attending promotion boards, taking difficult assignments, developing the intelligence specializations that would eventually bring me to flag rank. In the other register, I was carrying something that most of my colleagues did not know about and that I could not discuss. The reprimand was on my record, visible to selection boards, noted in my evaluations in the neutral bureaucratic language that the Navy uses to document things that cannot be removed. I had learned, during the years of carrying it, to neither over-explain it nor hide it. When selection boards asked about it, I gave the answer I had prepared, that the inquiry had been resolved and that the reprimand reflected circumstances that were themselves complex and that I had fully accounted for in my subsequent service. This was technically true in every word. It was also the most precise evasion I ever performed. What I didn't talk about in those years was what it had cost in the more private accounting. I was a commander, late, 2 years behind where I would have been, watching colleagues who were my contemporaries receive promotions at the schedule I had originally expected. I am not a person given to envy, and I want to be clear about that. But there is a particular kind of professional displacement that is not envy and not resentment, and is also not nothing. You run the timeline forward, you see where you would have been, you note the gap, then you put the gap in its compartment, and you go back to work. I did this repeatedly with the same consistency that my father ironed his shirts, and I became very good at it. What I did not put in a compartment, and what I am only willing to say clearly now, is how much I thought about my father during those years. Not with anger, with a complicated kind of attention. I watched his retirement unfold and his post-service life settle into its patterns. We spoke regularly, at least initially. We maintained the relationship in its externals. And I kept waiting for the question that never came. The moment when he would look at something that didn't quite add up and bring it to me and ask, "Is there something I should know about what happened in 2011? He never asked. He was a man whose analytical instincts had served him for 4 decades, and those same instincts told him the story had a clean ending, and he accepted the clean ending. I let him. I missed him at ceremonies during those years. I want to say that plainly. I am a Rear Admiral, and I do not require external validation to function, and I am not making a bid for sympathy, but I am also a person. And the person who was absent at the table when I made captain and absent at the room when I made Rear Admiral was the person whose opinion of my work had been the standard I was measuring against for most of my life. That cost something. I put it in its compartment and I went back to work. I was very good at compartmentalization. It was not a skill without price. In the summer of 2019, a partial declassification of the 2011 tribunal records made a summary of the proceedings available to cleared personnel. My name appeared prominently as the officer who had given the central statement in the inquiry. My cousin Derek Lawson, a mid-level government contractor in Washington with no background in military law and no framework for interpreting what he was reading, encountered those documents in the course of routine work. He called me first, asking if everything was all right. I told him it was old news. I knew when I hung up what was coming. Derek has never in his life held a piece of information longer than the time it takes him to find someone to deliver it to. He called his mother. His mother told my father. What my father heard was that my name was all through the tribunal documents and that it looked like I had been deeply involved in the inquiry. He heard this and constructed, with the analytical instincts of a man who had spent 4 decades in intelligence work, a theory that fit the available information. The theory was this: that his daughter, in 2011, had cooperated with the naval investigation in a way that undermined the case against him while advancing her own position. That she had used the situation, that what he had taken for a favorable resolution had been, in some way he hadn't understood at the time, engineered at his expense. He was wrong in the precise and exact opposite direction of the truth, but he believed it with the same confidence he had brought to every other assessment of his professional life. In the autumn of 2019, I drove to his house for what I intended to be a quiet conversation. He answered the door already different. Stiff, measuring, already arrived at a position I hadn't known he'd taken. He didn't make coffee. He asked me to sit. He told me what Derek had said. He told me his interpretation of it. He said, "Derek said it looked like you cooperated with the investigation." I said, "Derek doesn't know what he saw, Dad." He said, "Then tell me what he saw." I couldn't. The full picture of 2011 was still classified in the terms that would have been useful. I could not explain it in a way that gave him what he needed without disclosing information I was not authorized to share. I told him the documents were being misread, that I had been cleared of any wrongdoing, that the inquiry had resolved in a way that was procedurally standard. I watched his face while I said this. He heard evasion. I was not, I think, being fully honest with myself in that moment about the ratio of classified constraint to personal reluctance in what I offered him. Some of it was one, some of it was the other. I have had to sit with that. He started to pull away from me after that conversation in a way that was slow enough to watch and fast enough to hurt. The first Christmas after 2019, the invitation came from Patricia rather than from him. The gathering was at her house, and my father was there, and we occupied the same rooms for several hours without the conversation going anywhere real. I noticed his colleagues at the table responding to him differently than they used to, with a slight extra care, the kind of care you extend to someone who has recently become fragile in a way they don't fully recognize yet. I noticed that he had stopped asking for my opinion on things. For most of my adult life, even through disagreements, he had wanted to know what I thought. That stopped in 2020. The first promotion ceremony he missed was not in 2022. He missed a smaller recognition before that. A commendation I received in 2021 that the Navy held a brief ceremony for, and that I had let him know about because I still, at that point, was giving him the opportunity to show up. He didn't. He sent a card. The card said, "Congratulations." Nothing else. I kept it for a while. Then I didn't. By 2023, when the phone calls stopped being returned, I had arrived at a kind of flat acceptance. Not peace. I want to be honest about that distinction. Flat acceptance is when you stop expecting the thing to get better and start organizing your life around the gap. It is not a happy state, but it is a functional one. I organized my life around the gap. I became exceptionally good at not mentioning it. He began to withdraw from me after that conversation. Slowly at first, and shorter calls, a Christmas dinner where he spoke to me in monosyllables, a careful distance that offered nothing to hold on to. By 2023, it had become estrangement. He stopped returning my calls. He stopped attending my ceremonies. Several family members told me, through the secondhand channels these things travel, that he had taken to describing me at gatherings as someone who had betrayed the family's name. He used the word traitor. He said it more than once, in more than one context, in front of people who knew me. I was promoted to Rear Admiral, lower half, in 2022. He did not come. I was promoted to Rear Admiral, upper half, in 2025. He did not come to that one either. I told myself I had made peace with the situation, that I understood his position, even though it was built on a fundamental misreading of what had occurred, that I was not authorized to correct it. I am not sure, looking back, how much of that was true and how much was pride wearing the clothes of acceptance. A person can grow very comfortable in the posture of being misunderstood, particularly if that posture allows them to avoid the difficulty of a conversation they are not ready to have. I am not above that. I need to be honest about it. His 74th birthday dinner was in April of 2026. My Aunt Patricia, Richard's sister, the one person in the extended family who had not chosen a side throughout this period, called me 3 weeks before and asked me to come. She said it was time. I said I would think about it. She called back 2 days later and told me, with a plainness I respected, that she was not asking me to forgive him, or fight him, or have any particular kind of conversation. She just wanted me in the room, for her peace of mind, for the sake of what the family had been before all of this. I went. The dinner was held at the Naval Officers Club in a private dining room with white tablecloths and good silverware and a long rectangular table that seated 40. Several of the guests were retired military men, old colleagues of my father's, men in their 60s and 70s who had served with him in various capacities and who still carried themselves with the posture that the service instills and does not fully leave a person. Admiral Thomas Hargrove, retired, was at the far end of the table. He was 71 years old and silver-haired, and he moved through the evening with the unhurried quality of a man who had been in authority for so long that urgency was no longer part of his natural register. He and my father had been at the academy at the same time, decades before, and had remained connected in the loose way of men who share a particular era of service. He had been a senior JAG officer during his active years and had retired at full Admiral, 010, with a record the community spoke of with consistent respect. He had been invited as an old friend. I had not spoken with him in years. The dinner proceeded politely for approximately 90 minutes. I sat near the middle of the table. My father and I exchanged a nod when I arrived. We did not speak directly for the first portion of the evening, which suited both of us. The conversation around the table was the conversation of people who have been in the service and are now past it. Specific memories, old names, the satisfactions and frustrations of careers that had ended and lives that continued. About 90 minutes in, a retired colleague of my father's, Captain James Ellery, whom I had met a handful of times over the years, and who I knew to be a man of genuine goodwill, raised his glass and mentioned my recent promotion to Rear Admiral with what I recognized as sincere admiration. He said he had followed my career for some years and found it impressive. The table murmured in the way tables murmur when a toast is in progress and people are being polite. Several people at my end of the table added their agreement. Something shifted in my father's face. I watched it happen. I had time to note it and to decide in the 2 or 3 seconds before he stood that I was going to hold whatever posture I was already holding and not change it. He picked up his glass. He rose from his chair. He looked down the length of the table at me. He said, "I want everyone at this table to know what kind of person my daughter really is. Because if you're going to toast her rank, you should know how she got it." The room went quiet, not gradually, completely and at once. The particular silence of 40 people simultaneously deciding not to be the one who speaks. He said, "She's a worthless traitor. She sold her own family to advance her career. And I will not sit here and listen to people praise her for it." I set my fork down. I looked at him directly and I did not look away. I kept my hands flat on the tablecloth. My breathing was even. I had made a decision, somewhere in the years of estrangement, that I was not going to fight this battle on his terms. That whatever the truth was, it was going to have to come from somewhere other than me insisting on it. I held that decision. My hands were steady. I did not speak. The silence went on for 3 seconds. 4. Long enough that someone at the far end of the table began to push back their chair. Then Admiral Thomas Hargrove stood up. He did it unhurriedly, the way he did everything, apparently, pushing back from the table and rising to his full height without drama. The room watched him because he was the kind of presence that a room responds to without being asked. He looked down the length of the table at my father. His face held nothing readable. He said, "Rick." My father turned to look at him. He said, "She took your court-martial." 5 words. Spoken at a conversational volume, quiet enough that the people at the edges of the table leaned slightly forward to confirm what they had heard. But every person at that table heard them. I watched my father's face go through something that I do not have a precise name for. Not confusion, not anger, but a dissolution. I have held his posture in my mind ever since as a reference point for what it looks like when a person arrives at a truth they were not prepared for. The certainty that had organized his expression for 7 years simply left it. His hand found the edge of the tablecloth. His grip tightened on it. His legs, the legs of a man who had stood at attention on the decks of naval vessels through 4 decades of weather, seemed to lose their conviction. He went down in stages, first one knee on the dark hardwood floor, both hands still gripping the white cloth, and then fully, a 74-year-old man kneeling on the floor of a room where he had planned to celebrate his life. The tablecloth pulled slightly with him. Someone gasped. Patricia's husband Gerald was on his feet and moving toward my father within seconds. Patricia's hand found mine on the tablecloth. I did not move from my chair. The floor of the private dining room was dark hardwood. I remember watching it receive my father's weight. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, about all the things that had to be simultaneously true. That this man was my father, that he had formed me largely in his image, that he had called me a traitor in front of 40 people who respected both of us, and that the sole reason he had believed me to be a traitor was because I had done something that, by his own deepest values, the values he had spent 40 years trying to live by and had passed to me before I was old enough to understand what I was receiving, was among the finest things a person could do. I thought about 2011, the JAG office in Bahrain, the fluorescent light, the 2 officers across the plane table, my hands flat on the surface and my voice level and my account fully prepared. The drive back to the command ship afterward in the dark, the bunk room, the sound of the ship, the particular quality of making a large decision without ceremony, without witness, in a room where no one who loved you would ever know what you had just given. I had done that. I would do it again. What I felt in those seconds, sitting at that table, while my father's knees gave out on the dark hardwood, was something I have thought about many times since. I have described it in various ways in my own mind. Relief, exhaustion, a kind of completion. None of those words are entirely accurate. The closest I can get is this. There's a particular feeling that comes when something you have been compensating for, a weight you have been counterbalancing for so long that the compensation has become part of your natural posture, is suddenly removed. The absence itself is disorienting. You lean. You find new equilibrium. In the seconds after Hargrove spoke, I was finding new equilibrium, and it did not yet feel like anything I could name as positive. What I did not feel, and what I want to be clear about, was satisfaction. I had not wanted this to happen at a birthday dinner. I had not wanted it to happen in front of 40 people. I had wanted, if I am honest about the version of this I had imagined over the years, a private conversation, a direct accounting, a moment between 2 people rather than a public collapse. What I got instead was the truth arriving in its own timing and its own form, the way truth tends to, and I did not get to choose the shape of it. There is something I want to say about what it means to protect someone who never knows you have protected them. I have thought about it a great deal over the years, and I have arrived at this. It is not martyrdom. Martyrdom requires an audience, requires the knowledge of the sacrifice, requires some form of acknowledgement, even if only posthumous. What I did in 2011 had no audience. My father did not know. The JAG officers knew only the official version. Admiral Hargrove knew the real version, and he had stayed silent because the records were classified and it wasn't his story. For 15 years, the actual event existed in a space with no witness except me. That is a different thing from martyrdom. It is simply a choice, made privately, whose consequences you live inside without anyone to share the weight of understanding why you made it. I do not say this to elevate what I did. I say it because I think people sometimes misunderstand the nature of the choices that look, in retrospect, like sacrifices. They imagine the person who makes them felt something large and definitive in the moment, some clear moral clarity, some sense of rightness that sustained them through the consequences. My experience was more ordinary. I made a decision in a 48-hour window that seemed correct given what I knew and who I was and what I valued. I lived inside the consequences for 15 years. I did not spend those 15 years feeling noble. I spent them working and sometimes wondering whether the calculation had been right and going back to work. In the aftermath, the room reorganized around the emergency. Gerald and Derek, the same Derek whose inability to correctly read a classified document had set the second act of this story in motion, helped my father to his feet and guided him from the room. The guests departed in quiet groups. The birthday cake on the sideboard was not cut. I remained at the table until nearly everyone was gone. Patricia stood beside me for a while with her hand on my arm and did not speak, which was exactly the right thing. Admiral Hargrove sat down across from me when the room had cleared. He told me what he had known since 2011, that he had been the presiding officer at the tribunal, that he had read my statement and understood precisely what I was doing when I gave it. He said he had remained silent for years because the records were classified and it hadn't been his story to tell. He said he had watched my father's contempt build over years and had told himself, each time, that it wasn't his place to intervene. He said that tonight he had decided that argument had run its course and outlasted its justification. He said, "I should have found a way to say something sooner." I told him I didn't hold him responsible for the silence. I had chosen not to correct my father myself, repeatedly, over years. That had been my decision. He looked at me for a moment and said, "A 15-year-old decision has a weight limit. I think you've carried it long enough." I drove home alone that night with the radio off. The dinner moved through my mind in pieces. I had rehearsed some version of this moment at various intervals over the years. The truth surfacing, my father understanding, the situation resolving into something recognizable. The rehearsal had always felt larger than what actually happened. The real event was quieter. I was not triumphant. I was not vindicated. I was simply tired in a way that felt, for the first time, like it might be productive. For 15 years, I had been holding something still. Not only the secret, but the posture required to maintain it. That posture had cost energy I hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to release. My shoulders ached on the drive home. My hands on the wheel felt different. Lighter, somehow. As if I had been gripping something for a very long time and was only now, driving through the night, deciding to set it down. My father came to my apartment in August. He arrived without calling, in civilian clothes, holding nothing. He asked at the door if he could come in. I said yes and stepped back. He said, "I'm not here to explain myself. I don't think I can, honestly. I'm here because I owe you a conversation I should have asked for a long time ago." I made coffee. We sat across from each other in my living room in the afternoon light, and I told him what I had done in 2011. Plainly and in order. The operations room, the field communication, his call. My decision the following morning to go to the JAG office and give the statement I gave. The reprimand, the 2-year delay in my promotion. I told him that at the time I had not framed it to myself as sacrifice. I had thought of it as the decision that made the most sense given the variables. He was 59 years old with 37 years of service and a career worth protecting. I was 31. I had time I could afford to spend. The math of it was not sentimental. It did not need to be. He said, That's a more generous accounting than I deserve, I said. Maybe, but it's the true one. About 40 minutes into the conversation, something in his composure that had been holding very carefully gave way. His eyes filled. He did not speak for a moment. He said, I called you a traitor in front of people who respect you. I said it out loud and I meant it. I said, you did. He started to say something else. He could not get it out. I told him he didn't need to finish it right now. That what I needed, today, was for him to understand what had actually happened in 2011. That understanding was enough for now, and the rest could come later. He stayed another hour. When he prepared to leave, he stood in the doorway of my apartment for a moment and said that my mother would have known what to do with all of this. I said she would have sorted us both out years ago and we would not have gotten to this point. He almost smiled at that. Then he said he was sorry. The first time, across all of the silence and all of the years and all of the things said and not said, that he said those words to me directly. I looked at him. I nodded once. He walked down the hall. He stopped once and looked back at the closed door. Then he continued. It was not finished, but it had started. Those were different things, and both of them were real. I want to say something about the relationship between pride and blindness, because I have come to understand it more clearly through what happened with my father than through anything else in my life. My father was a proud man. Not arrogant, not dismissive of others, but deeply, fundamentally invested in his understanding of himself and the world. That pride had been, for most of his career, a strength. It gave him standards. It gave him consistency. It gave him the capacity to hold a line under pressure. The same pride, when it encountered a scenario it could not correctly interpret, became the thing that locked him into the wrong story for 7 years. He did not lack intelligence. He lacked the information that would have allowed his intelligence to reach a different conclusion. And he lacked that information because I had chosen not to give it to him. I need to hold both of those things at once, that he was wrong in a way that hurt, and that my own choices were part of what made the wrongness possible. That is not comfortable. I do not think it is supposed to be. In October, the Naval JAG Review Board issued a finding rescinding the 2011 reprimand from my service record. The board's letter cited new evidence establishing that the original record did not accurately reflect the source of the unauthorized order. I read it twice at my desk and put it in my drawer. I learned from a reference in that same letter that before I had even known a review was underway, my father had submitted his own voluntary statement to the board. He had identified himself, formally and for the record, as the officer who had given the unauthorized extraction order in 2011, and had confirmed that my testimony at the tribunal had been an act of protection rather than insubordination. He was retired. He was beyond any consequence the board could impose. He did not do it for any practical reason. He did it because it was right and because, I think, it was the only form available to him to say what he needed to say. He went on the record. He didn't have to. I thought about that for a long time after I learned about it. My father had spent his entire career understanding that the record was the thing, that what was documented was what was real. He had submitted that statement with full knowledge of what it meant to go on the record about an unauthorized operation that had produced a significant intelligence failure. He had done it at 74 with nothing to gain and a late life pride to spend. A man who can do that is not a man who is past changing. He is a man who is doing the work. I recognized the work. I had done it too, in a different form, 15 years earlier. Thanksgiving came in late November. Patricia's ham was exactly as inedible as it had always been. My contribution of roasted vegetables was received with a warmth entirely out of proportion to its quality, which told me something useful about the emotional temperature of the table. My father sat across from me, and we talked about Patricia's new dog and an old television program we both had memories of, and a fishing trip he had taken in October that had produced nothing except a good afternoon. He laughed at something I said, genuinely, the kind of laugh that catches a person off guard and runs longer than they intended. I had not heard that laugh in years. I hadn't understood, until it was back in the room, how much I had missed it. After dinner, when everyone else had moved to the living room, we found ourselves in Patricia's kitchen doing dishes together. He rinsed and handed things across. I dried them. It was an old rhythm from when I was a child in the houses we would pack and leave. At some point he paused with both hands still in the water. He said, "I was proud of you, before all of this. I need you to know that." I said I knew. He said, "I mean through all of it, after, even when I was being..." what I was being. I was still proud. I just didn't know the whole thing I was proud of. I kept drying the dish in my hands. I told him I was proud of him too. It was a complicated thing to say, and also completely true, and it was enough. In January, I was at my desk at the Pentagon in the early morning before the building had filled with the day's work. There was a photograph on the corner of my desk from my commissioning ceremony in 2002. My father in his captain's dress whites, his fingers positioned over my ensign's bars, both of us in the sunlight outside Bancroft Hall. I looked at it the way you look at something that has been there long enough to become part of the landscape. And you stop really seeing it, and then one day you see it again. I think about what it cost sometimes, not bitterly, just factually. The reprimand, the 2 delayed years, the 7 years of estrangement that I could have ended at any point if I had been willing to give him enough of the truth. I don't know whether I would make the same choice again if I were 31 and standing in that JAG office and the decision was still in front of me. I think I would. I think I was raised to be the kind of person who would. He raised me. He just didn't know for a long time what he had built. But he had built it every day from the kitchen in Norfolk onward, the gold bars on a lieutenant's shoulder, the toast after the funeral, the academy application on the kitchen table. It was all there. It had always been all there. He just didn't know what he was looking at until a retired admiral stood up at a birthday dinner and said 5 words into a silent room. My phone showed a text he had sent the night before, a photograph of the waterfront at sunset, the water going copper and the sky deep behind it. No caption. That was always his way. He did not write long messages. He sent you the thing he was looking at. It meant, I thought of you. He sent me a photograph the following week as well. His coffee cup next to a newspaper, very ordinary, with a small note that said he hoped I was well. The note was 12 words long. For my father, 12 words on a subject that was not operational or professional was an extended communication. I read it twice and put it on the corner of my desk next to the commissioning photograph. 2 images, 24 years apart. Both of them evidence of the same person, trying in the ways he knew how. I set the phone down. I turned to my work. Outside, the January light was coming through the window in the slow, deliberate way of early mornings, and the building was quiet around me, and it was a new year. And it was time to begin. I've thought a lot about what I would call the thing I did in 2011, not a sacrifice. I said that in the story, and I meant it. A choice. A decision made in a clear moment with a clear result. What I didn't account for was the 15 years that came after. The silence, the distance, and what it costs to hold something true when the person it concerns believes the opposite. If you've ever protected someone who didn't know you were protecting them, or if you've been on the other side of that, the one who got something wrong about someone they loved, I would genuinely love to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. I read them. And if you've ever been called something by your own family that was the exact opposite of what you actually were, if this story landed anywhere close to home, subscribe, hit the bell, and thank you for being here and for listening all the way through.